They called him a nobody, just a janitor, but what they didn't know, this nobody was watching, learning, and planning his revenge. 1 year later, he owned everything. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, bathing the empty hallway in a cold, sterile glow. It was well past standard office hours, nearly 10 at night, and most of the staff at Comard and Reeves Financial had gone home. Only a few determined souls still toiled at their desks, chasing the next deal or finishing urgent reports. Amid the near silence, Daniel Arroyo, a soft-spoken janitor, methodically pushed a mop across the gleaming marble floor. He was tall and thin, with slightly stooped shoulders from years of physical labor. He wore a simple uniform of dark blue pants and a matching button-down shirt, a name tag pinned above his heart. The smell of disinfectant and warm water clung to him, familiar and strangely comforting. To anyone passing by, Daniel would have appeared utterly inconspicuous, just a guy doing a menial job. In a place like Comard and Reeves, where multi-million-dollar transactions were discussed daily, someone pushing a mop was virtually invisible. That invisibility, however, had become Daniel's greatest asset. A mind full of observations, Daniel had worked as a janitor for several years, drifting from one building to another, until he found steady employment at Comard and Reeves. Unlike many in maintenance roles who kept to themselves, Daniel had a keen curiosity that refused to be silenced. He was no eavesdropper by nature, but in a busy financial firm, secrets roamed the hallways like restless ghosts. Whether it was absent-minded chatter around the water cooler or heated arguments behind half-closed conference room doors, Daniel had overheard more snippets of valuable information than one might imagine. He was particularly good at remembering names, numbers, and random pieces of market chatter. Over time, he noticed an interesting pattern. The same executives who sneered at him or ignored him were the ones throwing out revealing scraps of information without a second thought. They never bothered to lower their voices when the help was around. This dynamic had taught Daniel one thing: people rarely suspect that a janitor might be the smartest person in the room. Past of unfulfilled potential, truth be told, Daniel never saw himself as a janitor forever. In his youth, he had excelled in mathematics, often spending hours devouring library books on algebra and calculus. He even dreamed of attending a prestigious university to study engineering or finance, but life had other ideas. His mother fell ill, and the family finances collapsed under the weight of medical bills. Daniel left school early to help pay the bills, and those dreams of a fancy degree slipped through his fingers. What he never lost, though, was his quiet passion for learning. In the era of digital courses and endless free resources, Daniel continued to feed his intellect. He had spent countless late nights reading up on financial markets, analyzing historical stock trends, and even testing out small, hypothetical portfolios on paper. Each day he cleaned offices where powerful people brokered multi-million-dollar deals, and each night he returned to his cramped studio apartment, diving into spreadsheets and market analysis. Still, studying from the outside could only get him so far. The major gap was real-world experience and insider perspectives. But at Comard and Reeves, those insider perspectives were carelessly scattered everywhere, in half-shredded memos, in phone calls overheard at 7:30 p.m., in breakroom conversations between overly confident brokers. Gradually, these gleanings crystallized into a deep understanding of how the company and the larger financial world truly operated. One fateful evening on that specific night, just another late shift in a mostly deserted office, Daniel noticed a faint light seeping from under the door of conference room B. This was unusual because the cleaning schedule typically mandated that conference rooms were vacated by 9:00 p.m. He approached the door and heard tense voices, two men, presumably executives. He wasn't an opportunist by nature, but curiosity got the better of him. He leaned in, the mop momentarily forgotten, and strained to catch their conversation. Words like fraud, cover-up, and embezzle jumped out, crackling with illicit energy. His heart pounded. Were they discussing illegal activities within the company? He inched closer. "No one will find out if we move the numbers around," one voice muttered. "Just keep it off the official books for the next quarter. We'll figure something out before the end of the fiscal year," the other replied. Daniel froze. This was more than just gossip about a problematic client. This sounded like big trouble, a direct admission of financial wrongdoing. He'd suspected for a while that something shady was going on, given the subtle hints he'd picked up around the office, but this was as close to a smoking gun as one could get. His mop handle wobbled under the pressure of his grip. He realized he was standing on the brink of something huge, something that might topple a corporate giant. Yet no matter how big the scandal, Daniel was just a janitor to them. Who would believe him if he tried to blow the whistle? A decision as he backed away from the conference room door, Daniel made an internal vow. He would use this knowledge to fuel his own rise. That might mean gathering more information, continuing to learn about finance and stock investments, and waiting for the perfect moment to act. The flood of adrenaline in his veins made him realize how real it all was. If the executives were cooking the books, the entire company might be perched on the edge of a precipice. waiting for a small nudge to send it tumbling. Daniel continued mopping. Outwardly, he was just the janitor finishing his shift. Inwardly, he felt the first stirrings of a plan, one that might change his life forever and rewrite the story for everyone who ever laughed at him. He looked at the deserted corridors, thinking of how he had always moved unnoticed through them. Time to make them notice me. Eventually, tomorrow he'd show up for his shift again, act like nothing had changed, and keep his head down. But inside, Daniel was already a different man, forging a new destiny. Chapter 2, An Invisible Presence. Early the next morning, Daniel arrived at the office an hour before dawn. That was his usual schedule. No one questioned why the janitor might show up so early. It gave him ample time to do the initial round of cleaning before employees streamed in for the day. Yet today, he wore an extra layer of anticipation. He wanted to see if any of the big bosses arrived early, if any of them were discussing urgent crisis management after last night's conversation. In the lobby, the marble floors in the main lobby were polished to a mirror shine. A security guard behind a sleek white desk watched Daniel with passing interest, but the two had known each other for months. The guard, a thick-set man named Robert, greeted him with a perfunctory wave. "Robert, morning, Dan. Another early day, Daniel. Always. Gotta get these floors shining before the suits walk in." Robert, with a slight chuckle, "Better you than me." Robert meant no harm, but his comment reminded Daniel how easily others dismissed his role. Daniel smiled anyway. He was used to it. Besides, if everything went according to his emerging plan, soon he wouldn't be the invisible janitor. 1 year, he thought, repeating the silent promise he'd made to himself after hearing the executive's conversation. First sweep of the day, with his mop and bucket, Daniel made his rounds. He visited the first-floor restrooms, the break room, and the hallway leading to the back offices. No suspicious activity yet. The offices remained dim, the overhead lights off, but the faint hum of servers and computer monitors formed a soft backdrop. Eventually, he reached the second floor, the domain of junior analysts and a few mid-level managers. Here, the signs of late-night work were evident: half-empty coffee cups, scattered documents, a ghostly hush that suggested too many half-forgotten deadlines. Daniel carefully picked up loose scraps of paper, always glancing at the headings. The interesting ones he tucked away in a side compartment of his cart, a trick he'd learned over time. At 6:30 a.m., the building's automated system turned the lights on in the main corridors. The day's shift for analysts usually started around 7:30 or 8:00, so Daniel still had time to work without interference. He finished collecting trash, wiping desks, and systematically gleaning any tidbits of corporate secrets that might be left lying around. A chance encounter: as he turned a corner near the elevator bay, he nearly bumped into Eric Blanchard, one of the senior partners who occasionally arrived early. Eric was in his late 50s, hair carefully slicked back, wearing a suit that probably cost more than Daniel's monthly rent. Eric, with mild surprise. "Oh, Daniel, right." The fact that Eric remembered his name caught Daniel off guard. Usually, the upper-level executives barely recognized his face. "Daniel, yes, sir, sorry about that." "Eric, no problem, you're in early." "Daniel, always, sir." Eric didn't offer any additional pleasantries. He gave Daniel a quick, vaguely dismissive nod and continued on his way. But Daniel's sharp gaze caught the tension in Eric's shoulders, the slight furrow on his brow. He wondered if Eric was one of the two voices he'd overheard the previous night. Possibly. Eric was known to be heavily involved in the financial side of the company, and he had enough clout to move numbers around. Daniel made a mental note: if Eric was here at this hour, he might be dealing with damage control. The company might already be preparing to cover their tracks more effectively. Gathering evidence, building knowledge. After finishing his initial duties, Daniel retired to a small janitorial closet to organize what he'd collected. Nothing in today's scraps seemed as incriminating as what he'd overheard the night before. Most documents were run-of-the-mill statements or performance reviews. Still, he had a small USB drive where he stored scans and notes, hidden in a battered laptop at home. He would keep track of everything. He also mentally reviewed the moves he planned to make. Continue observing. He wouldn't confront anyone directly or blow any whistles just yet. He wanted to see how deep this fraud ran. Study finance at night. He doubled down on his self-education. He was decent at reading charts and analyzing data, but he wanted to be better, much better. Start investing soon, the biggest step. He had a tiny sum saved from living frugally. If he carefully picked the right stocks or funds, maybe he could grow that money. If he played it right, the knowledge gleaned from overheard conversations could help. One day, maybe he'd have enough capital to really change his life. But to think of buying the entire company, that felt outlandish, the stuff of daydreams. And yet, part of him refused to dismiss it as an impossible fantasy. The same mind that once tackled advanced math problems believed he could do more than just squeak by. Outside, the company building stirred to life. The hum of voices floated through the corridors as employees began their day. Daniel emerged from the closet, adopting his usual posture, shoulders slightly bowed, eyes down, face polite but neutral. He headed to the third floor to continue cleaning. In the eyes of everyone else, he was still the same quiet janitor, but in his mind, he was a man with a secret, a plan that was growing bolder by the minute. Chapter 3, Glimpses of Darkness, the Executive Suite. By lunchtime, Daniel found himself standing near the executive suite on the 10th floor. His job was to vacuum the plush carpets and empty the trash bins in the corridor, occasionally stepping into offices if the occupant was away. The 10th floor was usually off-limits for idle wandering, but janitors were given access to clean. With that keycard, Daniel could approach offices that many employees never even saw. Today, the door of the corner office was slightly ajar. The occupant was Martin Reeves, one of the founders of Comard and Reeves. Martin had a reputation for being suave in public but ruthless behind closed doors. Whispers circulated that he destroyed a smaller competitor by orchestrating a series of smear campaigns. Some employees revered him for his business acumen, others feared him for his cunning. Daniel stepped in to replace the trash bag. He kept his gaze low, feigning disinterest in the flurry of documents on Martin's desk, but his peripheral vision caught a computer screen displaying financial spreadsheets loaded with complicated formulas. Martin was on the phone, packing by the window, his voice tense. Martin, into the phone. I don't care how you do it, just get those books balanced by the end of Q2. If the auditors see the real numbers, we're done. Daniel's heart jolted. This is bigger than just a small-scale embezzlement, he thought. If Martin Reeves himself was stressed about covering something up, the entire company might be balancing on a razor's edge. He quietly finished emptying the trash and left the office as unobtrusively as he'd come in. Outside, he allowed himself a moment to absorb the gravity of Martin's words. The sense of pending crisis was becoming tangible. A network of collusion later, while cleaning the staff lounge adjacent to the executive suite, Daniel overheard a pair of lower-level managers talking in hushed voices. They were near the coffee machine, unaware Daniel was within earshot on the other side of a half-wall partition. Manager 1, I'm telling you the money's going somewhere. Our department budgets keep getting slashed to cover operational shortfalls, but we can't get a straight answer. Manager 2, I heard rumors. Something about shell companies or offshore accounts could be a major scandal, and if it hits the media, we're all out of a job. Manager 1, we can't speak up though. You know how Martin is. He'll bury us. They left, taking their coffee cups with them. Daniel leaned against his mop handle, his mind churning. The puzzle pieces were aligning: fraudulent accounting, possibly offshore laundering, hush-hush conversations among top executives. He was no lawyer, but he knew enough to realize these were serious crimes. Daniel's private refuge. By mid-afternoon, Daniel slipped away to a small storage room on the 7th floor that few people used. It was a quiet spot to take a break without prying eyes. He sat on an upturned box, munching on a sandwich he'd packed from home, tuna on whole wheat. Between bites, he jotted down notes in a well-worn notepad. Martin's phone call. Mentions of balancing books before Q2 ends. Possible shell companies, manager rumor. Linked to last night's conversation. Goal, keep collecting evidence, possibly use it strategically. He also noted that the managers said the company might collapse if this went public. A meltdown of Comard and Reeves would likely crash its stock price. In normal circumstances, employees would fear losing pensions or job security, but Daniel saw potential opportunity. If the stock price cratered but the underlying business still had potential, minus the corrupt management, someone with enough capital could swoop in and buy it cheaply. He closed the notepad, adrenaline making him jittery. The idea was outlandish, him buying a finance company, but what if he simply aimed to profit from the fallout? He could, for instance, short the stock when the scandal broke or invest in specific hedge plays. It was the type of cunning move he'd read about in finance blogs and textbooks. But for that, he needed money, serious money. He rummaged through his wallet to remind himself how much he had. $50 in cash, a battered debit card tied to a near-empty checking account, and a small emergency fund in a local credit union. That wouldn't cut it. He'd have to start small, build up gradually, then be ready to move when the time was right. Unnoticed but not unobservant at 5:00 p.m., the office filled with the usual end-of-day bustle. Employees left in droves, chattering about weekend plans or after-work drinks. Daniel busied himself near the glass doors leading out to the main elevator bank. Nobody paid attention to him as they tapped away at phones or rummaged in purses for keys. Occasionally, a few employees recognized him enough to offer a cursory, "Have a good evening, Daniel." He smiled politely. They had no idea he carried their secrets in his mind. By the time 6:00 p.m. rolled around, the noise levels subsided, leaving behind the after-hours crowd of managers, executives, and junior analysts rushing to meet deadlines. Daniel picked up his cart and continued his rounds, thinking about how best to position himself in the coming weeks. He was determined to keep his head low, remain invisible, and gather enough intel to make the right moves in the market. The swirl of corruption at Comard and Reeves, though dangerous, could be his golden ticket if he played his cards right. Chapter 4, Moonlight Education Life. After work, Daniel's night didn't end when he left the office. After finishing his shift at around 9:00 p.m., he clocked out, grabbed a quick dinner from a budget-friendly deli, and headed home to his tiny studio apartment in a less fashionable part of town. The apartment was on the fourth floor of an old building with peeling paint in the hallway and a temperamental elevator. Inside, the space was Spartan: a small bed, a bookshelf filled with finance and math tomes, and a worn-out desk supporting a second-hand laptop. The single window overlooked a cluttered courtyard where neighbors left bikes and random belongings. The only luxury Daniel allowed himself was a decent, high-speed internet connection, essential for his nightly ritual of reading and analysis. The late-night routine. By 10:00 p.m., Daniel was seated at his desk, eyes glued to his laptop screen, a spiral notebook open at his side. He wasn't just skimming articles, he was devouring them: financial news to see which stocks were moving and why, tutorials on options trading to understand the complexities of calls, puts, and how to hedge, technical analysis articles discussing moving averages, candlestick patterns, support resistance levels. Forums and discussion boards where both amateur and experienced traders shared tips. He had created a list of key companies that Comard and Reeves was known to invest in or advise for. He watched their stock movements, gleaning insights from the fleeting conversations he overheard at work. The synergy between his job and his studies was powerful. While some novice traders had to guess what big institutions were doing, Daniel had direct access to hearing them talk about it, however carelessly. That night he scribbled down notes about short-selling strategies. If Comard and Reeves truly was inflating its financials, it was only a matter of time before the truth came out and the company's stock plummeted. He wanted to be ready to capitalize on that moment. The final step, actually placing trades, would come once he built enough capital. Emotional hurdles. Despite his newfound clarity, Daniel wrestled with doubts. Could he afford to be morally comfortable leveraging information that wasn't exactly public? He reasoned that what he'd overheard was more than rumor. Some aspects were undeniably corporate fraud. But he also rationalized that the corrupt executives were harming innocent shareholders. By exposing them, or at least preparing for their downfall, Daniel wasn't exactly the villain. Still, the line was blurred. Insider trading was illegal, and he had to be very careful. At this point, though, he intended to use general market knowledge and logical inference. The whiff of wrongdoing might push him to short the company once it inevitably faced investigations. So, in a sense, he was making an educated guess. He also considered going to a whistleblower line, but that might ruin his chance to gather more information, and it could also endanger him if the company's top brass found out he'd snitched. Daniel decided it was safer to bide his time. Dreams of a different future. Some nights, when exhaustion overtook him, Daniel allowed himself a moment of wild daydreaming, stepping into the building 1 year later, dressed in a tailored suit instead of the janitor's uniform, and announcing that he'd bought controlling shares in Comard and Reeves. It was a cinematic fantasy, but it fueled him. The thought of those smug executives who mocked him turning pale and begging for their jobs stirred something in him, a sense of righteous justice. But after a moment, he always reminded himself that fantasies alone wouldn't pay off. Action would. He concluded his nightly studies around 1:00 a.m., eyes bleary but mind racing with possibilities. Tomorrow was another day, another chance to discover what shady dealings were happening behind the company's polished facade. Chapter 5, Beneath the Boardroom Table. Midweek revelations. Midweek at Comard and Reeves was always hectic. Quarterly reports were due soon, and the tension among senior executives seemed to escalate by the day. Daniel noticed that more and more employees stayed late, their eyes ringed with exhaustion. At the same time, he overheard frantic calls referencing numbers not matching up and needing last-minute adjustments. He suspected the meltdown was nearing. By Daniel's calculations, if the firm was really cooking the books, they couldn't keep it hidden much longer. Auditors or regulators would eventually sniff out the inconsistencies. The question was, would the scandal come to light naturally, or was someone inside the firm going to blow the whistle first? The unseen guest under the table. One evening, Daniel was tasked with setting up a conference room for a board meeting scheduled early the next day. That meant cleaning the floors, arranging chairs, and making sure the room was stocked with fresh notepads and bottled water. At around 7:30 p.m., as he was aligning chairs, he heard voices approaching. Panicked at the thought of executives berating him for being in the room at an inappropriate time, he instinctively ducked beneath the large oak boardroom table. He heard the door open, and two individuals walked in, flipping on a few lights. Voice 1, tight whisper: "We can't keep juggling these phantom accounts. The risk is too high." Voice 2, "We have no choice. Martin's orders. He wants the next quarterly statement to show profits up 12%. We can't do that unless we move money around." The voices were close. Daniel recognized them as mid-tier directors, though he couldn't recall their exact names in the moment. He crouched in the shadows, heart pounding, listening intently. Voice 1, if the SEC opens an investigation, we'll take the fall, not Martin. Voice 2, we should gather everything, prepare for the possibility that we might need to testify. But we can't let Martin know we're doing that. Daniel's adrenaline surged. If these directors were quietly preparing for a scenario where the top brass got indicted, it was only a matter of time before the fiasco broke open. The men ended the conversation quickly, turning off the lights and exiting the room. Daniel waited another minute, then cautiously crawled out. He had just obtained more confirmation that the company was deeply involved in fraudulent accounting. This meeting, though accidental for him to overhear, fortified his resolve. Repercussions for Daniel on a personal level. Daniel felt a weight in his chest. He was sitting on explosive information, the kind that could topple careers, ruin reputations, and alter the financial markets. But he also realized that once the scandal did go public, the stock value would plunge. That was the perfect opportunity for him to buy in, assuming he had the funds. He wondered if he could approach a smaller investor or maybe a hedge fund manager willing to back him, but who would trust a janitor with investment advice. Also, that would put him at risk if the arrangement went sour. For now, the best path seemed to be building his personal trading account, slowly but steadily. An unlikely ally later that night, after the building emptied out, Daniel made one final pass through the top floor. He stopped in front of an office belonging to Sylvia O'Connor, a relatively new hire who was making waves as a sharp legal mind. She was in her mid-30s, rumored to be from a humble background, and known to question anything that smelled fishy. Her office light was off, but the door was slightly open. Daniel peeked inside, noticing a thick file labeled "Confidential" on her desk. The label included references to financial compliance and SEC inquiries. He had a hunch that if anyone in the company was going to take a stand against corruption, it might be Sylvia. But Daniel couldn't just walk in and confide in her. He had zero credibility in the official hierarchy. Furthermore, meddling with a legal file was risky. If discovered, it could cost him his job or worse. Yet, the presence of that file was reassuring. It hinted that the legal department was sniffing around the improprieties. Perhaps the meltdown would come from within. Chapter 6, Embers of Humiliation, a casual degradation being mocked by executives, was nothing new for Daniel, but one particular incident stung more deeply than most. It happened when he was clearing trash bins in the hallway outside a large office suite where Martin Reeves, Eric Blanchard, and several other bigwigs were holding a late afternoon discussion. The heavy wooden door was open just enough for Daniel to hear snippets of laughter. Martin laughing loudly. I saw him fiddling with a computer once. Imagine, a janitor trying to do our job. Next thing you know, he'll think he can run a hedge fund. Eric joining in. Ha, right, the man can barely push a mop straight. The other voices chimed in with snickers. Daniel's cheeks burned. He paused, trash bag in hand, listening to them degrade him. Of course, they didn't mention him by name, but it was obvious who they meant. He was the only janitor on that floor during those hours. If it had been months ago, he might have felt only shame. But now he felt a spark of anger. He let this kind of ridicule slide in the past, but enough was enough. A steely resolve hardened in his gut. These very people who mocked him would regret it. Vented frustrations later, in a rare moment of camaraderie, Daniel found himself talking to Sam, another janitor who worked the evening shift. Sam was older, near retirement age, with silver hair and a gentler demeanor. They were in the break room, wiping down tables after the dinner rush. Sam, you look upset, kid. Everything okay? Daniel, just tired of some folks here. Sam, knowingly, executives giving you a hard time. Daniel shrugs. Yeah, they always treat us like we're subhuman. I just wish, he trailed off, not wanting to spill his entire secret. Sam nodded sympathetically. Sam, trust me, I get it. I've been cleaning up after suits for decades. You learn to tune it out. They might have fancy job titles, but that doesn't make them better people. Daniel, exactly. Though Sam seemed kind, Daniel resisted the urge to confide his deeper plans. He simply offered a grateful nod and returned to his tasks. The humiliation might have weighed heavily that day, but it also served as an accelerant to Daniel's ambition. Chapter 7, a modest start in the market. Opening a trading account with the deadline of 1 year floating in his head, Daniel decided it was time to move from theoretical simulations to real trades. He didn't have thousands of dollars lying around. He had barely scraped together $2,500 over many months of saving. Still, it was something. He opened an online brokerage account, choosing one with minimal fees and an easy-to-use platform. The day the account was approved, he deposited his modest sum. He took a deep breath as he stared at the available balance line, thinking every journey starts somewhere. First trades. Daniel spent hours evaluating his first move. Should he dip into penny stocks, gamble on a big swing, or be more conservative, maybe investing in stable exchange-traded funds, ETFs? He decided on a balanced approach, put half of his money into relatively safe ETFs and use the other half for more speculative plays. He wasn't going for immediate home runs but wanted to learn by doing. $1,250 in an S&P 500 ETF, a baseline investment, low risk, generally good growth. $1,250 divided among three mid-cap tech stocks, companies he suspected would perform well based on market trends and small comments overheard at Comard and Reeves. He clicked buy for each. The orders went through. He was now a shareholder. A tiny one, sure, but a shareholder nonetheless. Daily ritual each day after work, he reviewed the performance of his mini portfolio. He analyzed changes, read news on each company, and adjusted his mental models. The gains were modest at first, a few dollars up or down. Over the following weeks, those small wins started adding up. From $2,500, he rose to $2,750, then $2,900. He felt a jolt of pride at every incremental step. However, Daniel knew this was still pocket change compared to the amounts swirling around in Comard and Reeves, but his successes validated his approach. With patience, discipline, and the knowledge gleaned from inside a major financial firm, he could scale this up. Eventually, if he timed the downfall of Comard and Reeves correctly, by shorting their stock or capitalizing on the crash, he might leapfrog into a much bigger league. Weeks turned into months. This process continued for about 2 months. Daniel remained the ever-observant janitor, collecting scraps of insight wherever possible. He'd grown increasingly certain that Comard and Reeves was headed for a scandal. At times, he wondered if the meltdown would occur sooner than his one-year timeline. The price of Comard and Reeves' stock hovered in an oddly stable range, which he suspected was due to manipulative short-term boosts. The management kept painting a rosy picture to investors, new clients, expansions, partnerships, but Daniel saw the cracks. He heard the CFO ranting about black holes in the budget. He saw the hush-hush documents referencing emergency auditing measures. When he returned to his apartment, he charted the company's stock over time, overlaying rumors and overheard tidbits. He concluded that the best time to short might be right before the next quarterly earnings. If they were actively cooking the books, the day they had to release official numbers would be the day the facade collapsed, or soon after. Doubts and determination still, Daniel worried. What if the company somehow pulled off another cover-up? What if the market refused to punish them? This was the risk of relying on partially insider knowledge, but he reminded himself he wasn't orchestrating the fraud, he was merely anticipating its exposure. In the worst-case scenario, he'd lose some money, but not everything. Meanwhile, his other investments were slowly growing. In a sense, Daniel had never felt so alive. Each day was a test of his discipline and cunning. He was like a spy in plain sight, soaking up corporate secrets and translating them into actionable strategies. The executives might still laugh at him if they saw him in the hallway, but he had something they lacked: true insight into the precarious empire they'd built. Chapter 8, a night of unexpected consolidation. Company gala rumors swirled of an upcoming company gala, a glitzy affair meant to impress clients and investors. It was set to be held at a downtown hotel ballroom with chandeliers and fine catering. The entire vibe was meant to project Comard and Reeves as a stable, thriving financial powerhouse. Naturally, the senior staff and star clients were invited. A handful of other employees, mostly those with client-facing roles, would attend. As for Daniel, he was assigned the unenviable task of janitorial support for the event. That meant wearing a plain uniform, lurking behind the scenes, and cleaning up any spills. He'd been to such events before, always an invisible presence. The difference this time, he would keep his ears open for anything revealing. A chance to witness power games the night of the gala arrived. The ballroom sparkled with polished floors, crisp white tablecloths, and elaborate floral arrangements. Men in tailored suits and women in expensive dresses mingled, champagne flutes in hand. A live band played soft jazz in the corner. For Daniel, wearing black slacks and a matching shirt with a discreet name tag, it was business as usual. He noticed Martin Reeves, one of the owners, holding court near the stage, entertaining a cluster of potential investors with stories of the firm's recent achievements. Daniel recognized the glint in Martin's eye. The man was a consummate salesman. That skill might buy Comard and Reeves a little more time, but Daniel doubted it could save them in the long run. Across the room, Eric Blanchard and a few other senior partners were laughing boisterously with a group of venture capitalists. A server carrying a tray of canapés passed by, and Daniel discreetly inched closer to overhear. Eric, booming voice, "Of course we're expecting a record year. Our finances are in top shape. You won't regret partnering with us." The guests nodded approvingly. Daniel stifled an ironic smile. If only they knew, he thought. The cloakroom confidential. Near the end of the evening, Daniel was cleaning a side hallway when he heard hushed voices coming from the cloakroom, a small side area where coats and purses were stored. He recognized one voice as Sylvia O'Connor, the company's new legal star, and the other as an older male voice he couldn't place immediately. Unknown male voice: "Sylvia, you have to back down. If you push this, you'll be out of a job." Sylvia, resolute: "I can't just pretend it's not happening. We have a duty to shareholders." Unknown male voice: "Look, Martin and Eric have powerful connections. They'll bury you in legal fees. Is that what you want?" Sylvia: "If they think intimidation will stop me, they're wrong." Daniel's eyes widened. Sylvia was indeed sniffing around the wrongdoing. She seemed determined to do the right thing, even under pressure from higher-ups. The male voice was likely a senior colleague, maybe trying to caution or protect her, or perhaps to dissuade her from going against the tide. The conversation ended abruptly, with footsteps indicating they'd left in different directions. Daniel tucked away this information. Sylvia was a potential whistleblower. If she acted soon, the scandal might break earlier than expected. He needed to be ready to pivot his investments if that happened. An encounter with the higher echelons as the gala wound down, guests trickled out. While Daniel stood by to assist, he found himself face-to-face with Martin Reeves himself. Martin's usually slick expression looked slightly strained, likely from the effort of schmoozing all night. Martin, with forced politeness, "Still here, I see." Daniel nods. "Yes, sir, just tidying up." Martin gave a dismissive glance. "Well, you do a fine job," he said, though it sounded more like a reflex than a genuine compliment. Then he moved on, not bothering to shake Daniel's hand or meet his eye. Behind Martin trailed a few sycophantic employees, none of whom bothered to acknowledge Daniel's presence. He watched them leave, grateful in a way for their indifference. Had Martin been more perceptive, he might have questioned the janitor's curiosity and disarmed Daniel's entire operation. But that was the beauty of it. Powerful men rarely suspect the quiet ones. Chapter 9, An Unexpected Ally. EMERGES. Sylvia's late-night inquiry. 2 days after the gala, Daniel was emptying trash bins on the 6th floor when he nearly bumped into Sylvia O'Connor. She was juggling a stack of folders, her face etched with concern. Papers spilled onto the floor. Daniel kneeling quickly. "Let me help you." Sylvia muttering, "Thank you." They collected the scattered documents, some bearing official stamps and legal jargon about compliance and risk management. Sylvia sighed as she stood. "Sylvia, you work the evening shift, right? We've never really talked." "Daniel, I'm Daniel, janitor, among other things." Sylvia offering a tight smile. "Well, thanks for helping." She turned to leave but hesitated, as if weighing a thought. Finally, she turned back to him. "Sylvia, Daniel, do you ever notice anything unusual around here?" Daniel, "In what sense?" Sylvia, choosing her words carefully. "Oh, just sometimes mistakes in the records or odd transactions." "I realize it's not really your domain, but you're here late. You see a lot, don't you?" Daniel's heartbeat quickened. She was fishing for information, possibly suspecting that even a janitor could be a silent witness. He had to tread carefully. Daniel shrugging lightly. "I see papers thrown out that maybe shouldn't be. People talk in hallways, forget I'm around, but it's not my place to ask questions." Sylvia nodding. "I get it." "Well, if you ever see something that concerns you, I just wanted you to know you can come to me. No judgment. I'm on the company's legal team, so everything is confidential." She handed him a simple business card. Then she walked away, leaving Daniel standing there with more questions swirling in his head. If he approached her with specifics, could she help expose the fraud? Would that blow Daniel's own ambitions to pieces by hastening the meltdown before he was financially ready? He tucked the card into his pocket for safekeeping. Sometimes, life presents unexpected allies. Sylvia's courage and sincerity impressed him, but trusting anyone fully was still a big leap. Chapter 10, The Drip Feed of Stock Knowledge. Portfolio growth. In the weeks that followed, Daniel continued his dual life. By day, or evening more precisely, he was the diligent janitor sweeping floors and emptying trash. By night, he pored over financial charts, adjusting his small investment portfolio based on new insights. In that short span, his $2,500 investment started inching closer to $5,000 thanks to successful trades in undervalued tech stocks and a rising market overall. Those gains weren't enough to transform his life overnight, but the doubling of his seed capital was significant. It meant his research and careful strategy were working. With each uptick in his brokerage balance, his confidence grew. Signs of internal panic at Comard and Reeves. Panic was becoming palpable. Executives whispered behind closed doors, department budgets froze, and an unusual number of auditors began snooping around. Daniel guessed that Sylvia and a few others might have quietly triggered an internal audit. Papers disappeared from offices overnight. Entire cubicles were emptied, as if employees had been reassigned or, more likely, forced to leave. The environment crackled with tension. Daniel used these moments to glean even more knowledge. A half-shredded memo in Eric Blanchard's office trash indicated that top leadership was worried about liquidity issues. The firm was hemorrhaging cash, covering up shortfalls with creative accounting. If that was true, the next quarterly earnings call could be a bombshell. Strategic contemplation. Daniel weighed his trading plan. Short sell Comard and Reeves stock just before the earnings report. But to make a real impact, he needed more capital. Even if he shorted using all $5,000, he wouldn't be making the kind of kill that would let him buy the firm. He needed an exponential leap in funds. He considered margin trading, borrowing money from the brokerage to amplify his position, but that carried higher risk. If for any reason the stock spiked instead of collapsed, he could get wiped out. Still, time was ticking. If he was serious about a massive move, he might have to take a calculated risk. Chapter 11, The Deadline Looms Announcement of Earnings. Data memo circulated that the next quarterly earnings report for Comard and Reeves would be released in 6 weeks. The entire office atmosphere shifted from tense to downright frantic. Daniel saw the CFO rushing from meeting to meeting, often looking like he'd just swallowed a grenade. Martin Reeves uncharacteristically canceled his vacation plans. Eric Blanchard all but barricaded himself in his office, refusing to talk to reporters. For Daniel, this was the countdown. He hypothesized that if the fraud was as massive as he suspected, the truth would break around that earnings date, maybe slightly before if insiders leaked the details, or right after if the numbers couldn't be sugarcoated any longer. A risky move, Daniel made the bold decision to open a margin account with his broker. After passing their risk questionnaire, he gained access to double his buying power, which effectively gave him around $10,000 to trade. It still wasn't huge, but it was enough to make a more substantial short position on Comard and Reeves when the time came. He also began pulling small bits of credit from personal lines, a precarious strategy. He reasoned that if the scandal erupted as he predicted, he could repay those lines almost immediately with his profits, but if he was wrong, he'd be saddled with debt. The tension in his gut reminded him there was no turning back. His nightly routine grew more intense. He sketched timelines on notebook paper, analyzing possible triggers for the meltdown. He read every article that mentioned Comard and Reeves. He studied the short interest on the stock. Interestingly, it was rising, indicating other traders might suspect something too. He also set up multiple alerts. If the stock price suddenly dived more than 10%, he'd know news had broken. If it soared, he'd reevaluate. Meanwhile, he kept an eye on Twitter, Reddit, and other forums to gauge the rumor mill. 6 weeks, that was the runway. Chapter 12, A Secret Meeting in the Park. Sylvia reaches out one day. As Daniel was finishing his shift, he received an unexpected text from an unknown number. Unknown. It's Sylvia. I'd like to talk off the record. Meet me at Riverside Park tomorrow at 6 p.m. Daniel stared at the screen. The thought of meeting Sylvia outside the office intrigued and worried him. Why was she reaching out to the janitor? Did she suspect he knew more than he let on? Despite his caution, curiosity tugged at him. He replied with a simple yes. The park encounter. The next evening, Daniel arrived at Riverside Park, a serene stretch along the river, dotted with benches and walking paths. Sylvia stood under a lamppost near a stand of poplar trees. She wore a light jacket, her expression guarded. Sylvia quietly, "Thank you for meeting me. I know this is unusual." Daniel, "No problem. What's on your mind?" They began strolling along the path, the sound of water lapping against the bank. Sylvia hesitated before speaking. "Sylvia, I've been looking into some of the accounting practices at Comard and Reeves. Let's just say it's bad, worse than I initially thought." Daniel, "I've overheard rumors that something big is happening." Sylvia, nodding grimly, "I can't reveal too much detail, attorney-client privilege, plus I'm not sure I can trust everyone. But from the fragments I can share, there's a huge shortfall that the leadership has been covering with fraudulent transactions. If it becomes public, the company's stock could plunge, maybe even lead to bankruptcy." Daniel's heart pounded. This was the confirmation he needed. He decided to give Sylvia a tidbit of reassurance that she wasn't alone in her suspicions. "Daniel, I believe you. I've seen enough to suspect the same. You're taking a risk by investigating." Martin and Eric. "They won't let this slide easily." Sylvia exhales. "I know. That's why I'm trying to figure out if there's anyone inside the company who can back me up, somebody without a vested interest in protecting the fraud. The auditors are compromised. The CFO is complicit. It's a mess." She paused, as if weighing whether to say more. They stopped at a bench overlooking the water. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. "Sylvia, Daniel, I know you're just the janitor, but you're there late hours, you see things, hear things. If you ever come across documents or evidence that could help build a case, please bring it to me. I'm trying to do the right thing, but I can't do it alone." He studied her earnest gaze. She was genuinely trying to save the company, or at least expose the corruption for the sake of justice. This put Daniel in a tricky spot. He wanted the scandal to break, but in the timing that best served his financial plan. "Daniel, I'll keep my eyes open. If I find something concrete, I'll let you know." Sylvia nodded, relief and tension warring on her face. They parted ways, each burdened by secrets that could alter countless lives. Chapter 13, Moral Quandaras, and Red Lines, The Whistleblower's Dilemma. Over the next few days, Daniel grappled with his conscience. On one hand, his personal ambition dictated waiting for the perfect moment to short the company's stock for maximum gain. On the other hand, he realized that if Sylvia or another whistleblower exposed the fraud earlier, the meltdown could happen at any moment. Could he, in good faith, delay giving Sylvia incriminating evidence just so he could line his pockets? That felt morally gray, if not outright reprehensible. Yet these were the same executives who had openly mocked him, the same men who stole from shareholders and employees alike. Did they deserve any consideration? An accidental discovery one evening, as Daniel was vacuuming the office corridor, he heard loud cursing coming from Eric Blanchard's office. The door was cracked open, and inside, Eric was rummaging through drawers, flinging papers aside in frustration. Eric muttering angrily, "Where's that file? I swear I had it here." Suddenly, Eric's phone rang. He snatched it up, yelling into the receiver, "Eric, I can't find the damn file with the offshore ledger details. No, I haven't destroyed it yet." "Of course Martin told me to. What do you think I'm trying to do?" Daniel's pulse kicked. An offshore ledger was a smoking gun. If it revealed the laundering of funds, that would be conclusive proof of illegal activity. This might be the very document Sylvia could use. But if Daniel alerted Sylvia too soon, the meltdown might occur before he was financially positioned. He withdrew into a nearby supply closet, mulling his choices. Find that file, or at least a copy, and keep it until just before the earnings call, or give it immediately to Sylvia. A line in the sand that night, Daniel slept fitfully, haunted by ethical conundrums. By morning, he made a decision. He would try to locate that file, because letting it vanish would be a travesty. He would hold it discreetly. He told himself he wasn't betraying Sylvia. He was just ensuring the scandal broke at the most advantageous time. It was a calculated compromise. He wouldn't sabotage the whistleblowing. He would merely orchestrate its timing to align with his trades. If that was morally questionable, he'd justify it by recalling the sneers and corruption he'd endured. He was convinced that, at the end of the day, justice would still be served, and he would finally get his share of triumph. Chapter 14, A Glimpse of the Ledger. The hunt begins. Daniel intensified his routine. When floors were deserted, he'd sneak peeks into offices of key figures. Eric Martin, the CFO. He wasn't stealing anything. He simply rummaged through trash bins, scanned desks for any mention of offshore ledger or suspicious numbering systems. A week passed without results. The tension in the company soared. The stock was curiously stable, but Daniel suspected it was a calm before the storm. Official earnings date was now 4 weeks away. If the scandal broke sooner, Daniel's plan might unravel. A breakthrough at last in an unremarkable scenario. Eric had left his office unlocked while stepping out. Daniel seized the chance. He slipped inside, glancing over the tidy desk. A locked drawer caught his attention. He tried it slid open. Odd, perhaps Eric forgot to lock it properly in his haste. Inside was a worn manila folder labeled with a single word, Marisol. Daniel opened it. Pages upon pages of transactions scrawled in spreadsheet format, referencing accounts in the Cayman Islands, Luxembourg, and other offshore havens. The sums were enormous, dwarfing anything Daniel had seen. Multi-million-dollar entries disguised as consulting fees, marketing, or management incentives. Each line item corresponded to some code or shell company name. His heart hammered. This was definitive proof of money being siphoned out of the main accounts. Not only was it likely illegal, but it also matched the earlier speculation about fraud. If Sylvia had this, the case would be airtight. If regulators saw it, Comard and Reeves would be done. Not so alone. As Daniel carefully snapped pictures of the documents with his phone, he heard a noise outside. Footsteps. The doorknob rattled. Acting on instinct, he dove under Eric's large mahogany desk, hugging the phone to his chest. Eric entered, flipping on a desk lamp. Eric, irritated, "I could have sworn I left that drawer locked. Where is it?" Daniel froze, hardly daring to breathe. He heard Eric shuffling papers on top of the desk. Then the drawer squeaked open. Eric muttering, "What the someone's been in here, damn it." A pregnant pause, as if Eric was scanning the room. Daniel's heart thudded against his ribcage. Any second now, Eric might check under the desk or open the side panel. But to Daniel's relief, Eric yanked something from the drawer, likely the ledger folder, and left the room, slamming the door behind him. Daniel exhaled shakily. He'd escaped detection, but Eric had realized the folder was disturbed. Now Eric would be more vigilant. Yet Daniel managed to capture photo evidence on his phone. He carefully waited another minute, then slipped out into the corridor. Chapter 15, The Leverage. What to do with the photos. Back in the janitorial closet, Daniel locked the door behind him. His hands trembled as he flipped through the pictures on his phone. Page after page of damning transactions. He needed to protect these photos. They were gold. He quickly emailed them to a secure account he'd created under a pseudonym. Then he wiped the phone's browsing history and logs just in case. He now possessed nuclear-level leverage. If Comard and Reeves tried to spin a fairy tale during earnings, this ledger would destroy their illusions. If Daniel gave these photos to Sylvia right now, the meltdown might happen within days. But his plan relied on short-selling the stock once he was sure the meltdown was imminent. A dangerous game. Daniel recognized that time was the crucial factor. The official earnings release was 4 weeks away. If he acted too soon, the scandal might break, and he'd have no position in the market to profit from it. Waited too long, a leak from another source might catch him off guard. He also worried that if Eric discovered the folder missing or tampered with, he'd clamp down on security. But at least Daniel had digital copies. Eric might burn the original, but the truth was out of the bottle. Contacting Sylvia, He considered texting Sylvia an anonymous tip, something like, check Eric's drawer for a ledger labeled Marisol. But Eric already took the folder from the drawer, likely to hide it elsewhere. If Daniel misjudged, he could spook them into an early confession or a desperate act. For the moment, Daniel decided to stay quiet, biding his time. He was playing a high-stakes game, one that could catapult him into a millionaire or ruin him entirely. As he left that night, the city lights shimmering outside the office windows, he felt the full weight of his ambition. Chapter 16, Shifting STRATGIS and Spyware Preparing the short position with the ledger photos in hand, Daniel felt more certain than ever that the meltdown was coming. He began shifting his portfolio to free up as much cash and margin as possible for a short bet on Comard and Reeves. Some of his profitable tech stocks he sold off, netting a gain, and he closed out smaller positions in other companies. He planned to wait until just a week before the earnings call to place his short position. That would minimize the amount of time he could be caught in a short squeeze or face unpredictable market swings. He just hoped the scandal wouldn't erupt prematurely. Digital surveillance in the meantime, Daniel discovered a discreet approach to gather more intel. Employees often left their computers unlocked. A janitor with a cleaning rag could stand behind a desk for a few minutes without arousing suspicion, especially after hours. Daniel installed a small keylogging program on a few computers belonging to middle managers known to be involved in financial reporting. He wasn't proud of the illegal step, but he rationalized that the company was rotten at the top, and he needed every edge to ensure he timed things perfectly. He avoided using company networks for the install, relying instead on a USB drive. The data from these keyloggers would be sent to a private server he'd set up on the dark web. This was dangerous territory, but Daniel saw no alternative. The executives were forging numbers, and time was short. Any scrap of information gleaned might confirm or refute the meltdown timeline. Chapter 17, The Calm Before the Storm, An Atmosphere of Anxiety. The entire office seemed to hold its breath as the earnings date approached. The CFO's frantic expressions had only grown more pronounced. Martin Reeves was rumored to have had screaming matches behind closed doors. Eric Blanchard's staff avoided him as much as possible. Meanwhile, the rank-and-file employees were on edge, as rumors of layoffs or reorganization circulated. Daniel was a silent observer, pushing his mop, emptying trash cans, and noting every detail. He saw new locks installed on certain filing cabinets, an IT guy reconfiguring password protocols, and tension-laced glances exchanged in hallways. People seemed to sense something big was about to happen but didn't know what. A glimpse at the keylogger data 3 days before he planned to short the stock, Daniel checked the keylogger feed on his personal laptop at home. Though he was no master hacker, the simple logs of typed conversations revealed a bombshell. Managers discussing false revenue entries and how they might have to pull the plug if the external auditors discovered them. One typed message read, "If we get a subpoena, we deny any knowledge. Martin and Eric are making us do it." It was as damning as it was tragic. Low-level employees were coerced into participating. The meltdown seemed guaranteed, likely at or just before the earnings call. This matched Daniel's plan perfectly. He had enough confirmation now. An unexpected email while reviewing these logs, Daniel's personal email pinged. It was from Sylvia. "Sylvia, Daniel, I've found significant evidence of fraud. The board meets on Wednesday to finalize the earnings statement. If they try to present falsified data, I'm going to the authorities. I just wanted to let you know, if you have anything that can help, now's the time. Please be careful." I sensed desperation from them, and desperate people do desperate things. Wednesday, the day before the earnings report was to be released to the public. That meant Daniel had only a few more days to secure his final position. She was giving him a gentle heads-up. The meltdown might indeed happen sooner than scheduled if the board meeting turned explosive. He typed a brief response, acknowledging her concern but not committing to handing over anything yet. Tension thrummed in his chest. If she blew the whistle on Wednesday morning, the stock could tank instantly. He had to act now. Chapter 18, The Crucial Trade, Placing the Short Bet. It was Monday morning, 3 days before the board meeting, 4 days before official earnings. Daniel woke up before sunrise, anxious to finalize his moves in the pre-market trading window. He transferred all available funds, plus the margin extension, into a short position on Comard and Reeves. In total, he was shorting about $50,000 worth of stock, a substantial sum given his meager beginnings. His heart hammered as he confirmed the trade. If the scandal broke within the next few days and the stock nosedived, he'd reap a windfall. If the company somehow skated by or manipulated the narrative, he could lose everything and still owe money to the broker. Anxiety at work that day at Comard and Reeves, he was hypervigilant. Every time he saw an executive, his mind buzzed with the knowledge that he was financially betting on the company's collapse. He worried one of them might sense his tension, but none did. He was still just the janitor. People scurried about, finalizing slides for the board meeting, reviewing last-minute numbers. Daniel felt an odd mixture of guilt and eagerness. He was rooting for the truth to come out, for justice to be served, but also for the stock to plummet so he could realize profits. He reassured himself that the scoundrels in charge deserved what was coming. Chapter 19, Wednesday's Reckoning. The board meeting Wednesday dawned gray and drizzly. The board meeting was set for 9:00 a.m. in the executive conference room. Senior partners, major shareholders, and key department heads gathered behind closed doors. Daniel lingered in the corridor, pretending to polish the floor with a buffer. Through the heavy door, he could hear raised voices. Martin, muffled, yelling, "We have to present strong numbers. We have no choice." Unknown voice, "The auditors won't sign off if they see these discrepancies." Eric, angry, "Tell them it's a rounding error or we'll find new auditors. We can't show a 30% drop in revenue. Our stock will crash." Daniel's pulse raced. This was it, the meltdown in real time. Sylvia's bold move. An hour later, the door swung open and people stormed out. Some looked shocked, others looked furious. Sylvia stepped out last, flanked by 2 other legal associates. She spotted Daniel and gave him a grim nod. Then she walked away, phone pressed to her ear. Daniel guessed she was already contacting external authorities. The meltdown would likely happen within hours, if not minutes. By now, the short position he placed could soon skyrocket in value. He fought an urge to check his phone. In fact, he needed to remain calm. The stock's reaction, sure enough, at around 11:00 a.m., rumors started spreading on financial news sites. Comard and Reeves board in turmoil, possible accounting discrepancies. The stock, which had opened at $22 a share, began to slip to $20, then $18, then $16 by noon, as panic sellers jumped ship. Daniel took a quick break to check his brokerage app in the janitorial closet. He was already up thousands of dollars on paper, as his short position soared in value, and the day wasn't over yet. Chapter 20, The firestorm. Afternoon collapsed. By mid-afternoon, multiple outlets, including Bloomberg and Reuters, reported that Comard and Reeves might delay the official earnings release amid allegations of financial misconduct. As the trading day went on, the stock cratered to $12, a near 50% drop from just that morning. Traders smelled blood. Daniel felt a surreal rush. He was making money faster than he had ever imagined. Only question was, should he close his short position now and lock in profits, or wait for an even bigger plunge? He decided to hold. The real fallout might push the price even lower. Office chaos inside the building. Executives and staff frantically grabbed personal belongings and huddled in panicked conferences. Some fled early, claiming urgent business offsite. Martin Reeves barricaded himself in his office, refusing calls. Eric Blanchard roamed the halls, barking at anyone who crossed his path. The entire aura of corporate confidence had transformed into that of a sinking ship. Daniel kept a low profile, quietly finishing his shift. Yet he was acutely aware that he was, in some ways, orchestrating this moment. He had placed the bet that all their lies would be exposed. A small gesture of mercy toward the end of the day, he saw an administrative assistant crying by the vending machines. Her name was Lena, someone who had always been polite to Daniel. Through choked sobs, she confessed she was terrified the company would go under, and she'd lose her job, her only means of supporting 2 kids at home. Daniel felt a pang of empathy. Not everyone in the firm was corrupt. Most employees were regular people who would be collateral damage in this fiasco. He gently tried to reassure her, offering a few words of kindness. But he stopped short of revealing he was about to become wealthy thanks to the very downfall that frightened her. Chapter 21, The next morning, stock in freefall. Thursday morning arrived with more damning headlines. Comard and Reeves under investigation for fraud. Whistleblower evidence surfaces. The stock opened at $9 and plummeted to $5 within the first 2 hours of trading. A 70% drop in less than 24 hours. Frenzied selling triggered multiple circuit breakers on the exchange. Daniel was still short, which meant every dollar drop in the stock multiplied his profits. By noon, it bottomed out near $4. He turned his initial $50,000 short position into a potential gain of over $200,000 if he closed it at that level. Locking in, he knew shorting was risky. Prices could bounce unpredictably. By 1:00 p.m., he decided to lock in the lion's share of his profits. He set limit orders to buy back shares at $4.25. The orders filled almost instantly. The difference between the $22 short price and the $4.25 buyback netted him a massive gain. He stared at his brokerage account, hardly believing the number. $220,000 in realized profits, give or take a few hundred for commissions. From $5,000 to well over $200,000 in a matter of months. He was officially well off. Not a multimillionaire yet, but far beyond what he ever had. As the day wore on, the stock dipped under $4, so he made an additional smaller gain on any leftover positions. By market close, he was looking at a balance near $250,000. This was the beginning, not the end, he reminded himself. Chapter 22, Controlling Interest Planning. The next move, Comard and Reeves was in freefall, but not yet bankrupt. If the authorities proved large-scale fraud, the company might face criminal charges. The brand's reputation was severely tarnished, and big clients were already jumping ship. Martin Reeves and Eric Blanchard were probably huddled with legal teams, trying to stave off an SEC raid. Daniel's newly fattened brokerage account gave him a bold idea. Could he accumulate a controlling stake if the shares continued to drop? He'd need millions, typically, to own a significant chunk of a public company. But with the price now under $4 and likely to keep falling, the entire market capitalization might become shockingly small. He spent the night analyzing the company's outstanding shares and market cap. He discovered that Comard and Reeves, once valued at billions, had cratered to a market cap of roughly $200 million and dropping. He certainly didn't have that kind of money, but sometimes one didn't need full ownership. A smaller controlling stake or a leveraged buyout with partners could place him in the driver's seat. Leverage and partnerships. If the stock continued to tank to $2 or $1, the company's total market cap might be a fraction of $200 million. Daniel realized if he found outside investors or loans, private equity perhaps, he might orchestrate a purchase. His confident grin widened. The very idea was insane, yet within reach. Moreover, if the brand was fundamentally profitable minus the corrupt leadership, it could be turned around. That's how many leveraged buyouts worked. Investors swoop in when a company is undervalued, clean house, and eventually rebuild. He began scouring for potential partners, anonymous calls to smaller private equity groups, local investment clubs. He spun a story of how Comard and Reeves had a robust infrastructure but was crippled by fraud at the top. With the right injection of leadership and capital, it could rise again. Chapter 23, An Unlikely Consortium Meeting Potential Backers. Daniel arranged clandestine meetings in cafe back rooms and private offices. He pitched his idea to small investment outfits. We can buy up a significant stake in Comard and Reeves, leverage the current scandal, and pivot it into a restructured financial firm. Most laughed at first, wondering who this random investor was. But once he demonstrated that he had $250,000 in liquid capital and insider knowledge of the company's real operations, a few eyebrows rose. He explained how the executives were likely to face legal repercussions, creating a vacuum for new leadership. Some groups politely declined, fearing the negative PR. Others were intrigued. With enough loans and a structured deal, they could put together a few million. Not enough to own the company entirely, but enough to accumulate a significant chunk if the stock kept tanking. If a group gained 20–30% of the shares, that might swing major voting power. Building momentum within a week, Daniel cobbled together a small consortium of risk-taking investors. They pooled together around $5 million in potential capital. The plan was simple yet bold. If Comard and Reeves' stock dropped below $2, they'd start buying in bulk. They'd continue to buy if it sank further, aiming to accumulate as many shares as possible. Daniel would personally invest his $250,000, and in return, these backers agreed to name him as the figurehead of the new ownership group. It was an insane proposition. A 29-year-old janitor turned day trader, stepping in as partial owner. But the backers were counting on Daniel's unique insights and the storm of press that would come from such an underdog narrative. Chapter 24, The Death Spiral of CALMARD and REVES. Public outrage and criminal charges. As the second week post-scandal dawned, Comard and Reeves faced lawsuits from multiple directions. The SEC launched an official investigation. Shareholders filed class action suits. Internal whistleblower accounts emerged, naming Martin Reeves, Eric Blanchard, and several others as orchestrators of fraud. The CFO resigned. The media pilloried the once respected firm, labeling it a den of thieves. The stock fell below $2 after another wave of selling by institutional investors who wanted to avoid further losses. By now, the company was a husk of its former self, with a skeleton staff and board members resigning left and right. Initiating the buy-in, Daniel's consortium pounced. They began buying blocks of shares at $1.85, then $1.60, then $1.40. Over the course of a few days, they accumulated a significant percentage of outstanding shares. Other speculators joined, anticipating a potential rebound if the scandal stabilized. The final push came when the stock dipped to $1, the psychological barrier. Daniel and his partners swooped in, acquiring more and more shares until they surpassed 30% ownership as a group. While not a majority, it was enough to influence board decisions, especially with the exodus of existing directors. Daniel's personal stake was smaller in raw percentages, but by virtue of the arrangement with his backers, he was recognized as the driving force. He found himself, unbelievably, in a position to demand a seat at the table, the main seat, in fact. Chapter 25, The Boardroom Showdown. Enter the new owner. Word spread through financial circles that a mysterious group had bought a large chunk of Comard and Reeves. Speculation raged about who was behind it, when it was revealed that the central figure was none other than Daniel Arroyo, a former janitor at the firm. The media had a field day. Janitor TURNS magnate, read one headline. Others doubted the story's veracity until official filings confirmed it. On a crisp Monday morning, Daniel arrived at the building in a modest but well-fitted suit. Gone was the janitor's uniform. He walked up to the same reception desk he once passed silently, acknowledging the stunned guard with a nod. Robert the guard. Daniel, you what? Daniel, smiling politely. I'm here for a board meeting, Robert. Robert gaped, then glanced at his screen. Indeed, an official notice indicated that the new ownership group was convening in the main boardroom. As Daniel rode the elevator to the top floor, a kaleidoscope of emotions churned in him: triumph, nerves, anticipation. Martin Reeves and Eric Blanchard inside the boardroom. The few remaining original executives sat in grim silence. Martin Reeves had aged a decade in the past month, dark circles under his eyes. Eric Blanchard looked equally defeated, glancing furtively at the newcomers. They had little leverage left. Both were under investigation, with personal assets frozen. Brand they'd built lay in ruins, now sold off in massive chunks on the open market. When Daniel entered with his new partners, a hush fell over the room. Martin's mouth dropped open slightly, and Eric's eyes narrowed. They recognized him immediately, but neither spoke. Daniel calmly taking his seat at the head of the table. Gentlemen, it's been a while. He surveyed the once powerful men who'd mocked him as just a janitor. Now they sat, forcibly, at the opposite end of the table, stripped of authority. The sense of poetic justice was almost overwhelming. A declaration of ownership. The meeting began with formalities. The corporate lawyer from Daniel's consortium outlined how they had legally acquired a controlling stake. Given the fiasco, nearly all voting members resigned, leaving the path clear for Daniel and his team to appoint new leadership. When the lawyer asked if Martin Reeves or Eric Blanchard had any objections, they remained silent. They knew they were out of moves. Daniel, leaning forward: Eric, Martin, we appreciate your past contributions to the firm's name, but your recent actions have left it in a precarious state. Effective immediately, your positions are terminated. Martin opened his mouth to protest, but no words came out. Eric grimaced, looking down. The room stayed silent. Daniel, pack your belongings. We'll arrange for a more thorough audit. We'll also be cooperating fully with the SEC investigation. And just like that, they were done. Men who had once boasted about their power over him now faced unemployment, lawsuits, and potential jail time. A final word as they stood to leave. Eric mustered enough pride to glare at Daniel. Eric, this is insane. You're going to run this place into the ground. You're a nobody. Daniel, coolly, you called me that once before. You forgot. People you label nobodies can surprise you if you ignore them long enough. Eric stormed out, Martin trailing behind, shoulders slumped. Daniel exhaled. The room felt electric. He had just accomplished the unthinkable. A year ago, he was cleaning these floors. Today, he owned the company, or more precisely, controlled it with his partners. Chapter 26, Aftershocks and Restructuring. Media. Frenzy news outlets clamored for the story behind the janitor who bought Comard and Reeves. Overnight, Daniel became a minor celebrity in financial circles. Journalists hounded him for quotes, wanting the inside scoop on how a lowly janitor orchestrated such a coup. Daniel, ever cautious, kept interviews brief and polite. He credited a committed group of investors for believing in his vision. Behind closed doors, he credited his own relentless study and the overheard secrets for paving the way. Rebuilding the brand now came the real work. The new team had to salvage the remains of Comard and Reeves. They needed to reassure clients, address lawsuits, and navigate criminal investigations. Daniel appointed interim CEOs, seasoned professionals from his consortium's network, to manage day-to-day operations while the legal cases played out. He personally oversaw the process of rooting out any remaining corruption among mid-level managers. Some were fired, some resigned voluntarily, and a few proved they had no part in the fraud. The company rebranded its core departments, shutting down the shell subsidiaries that had funneled money offshore, supporting innocent employees. Remembering Lena, the crying assistant by the vending machine, Daniel took steps to protect regular employees from the fallout. He introduced severance packages for those let go due to downsizing. He also revised the internal culture: no more mocking or demeaning language toward staff. The new motto was about transparency, fairness, and innovation, a stark contrast to the old regime. Chapter 27, RUNIONS and REFLECTONS. Conversation with Sylvia. Amid the corporate whirlwind, Daniel scheduled a private meeting with Sylvia O'Connor, the courageous legal mind who had risked her career to expose the fraud. She walked into his new office, a sleek space on the executive floor that Daniel barely used because it felt too grand. Sylvia smiling. Congratulations, Mr. Arroyo. You pulled off what none of us could have imagined. Daniel, I owe you a debt of gratitude, Sylvia. Your whistleblowing sped up the downfall of the old guard. Sylvia, blushing slightly. I'm just glad the truth came out. I had no idea you were orchestrating a takeover. Daniel, to be honest, it wasn't planned from day one. It evolved when I saw a chance to rewrite my story and the company. They talked for an hour, discussing the company's future. Daniel offered Sylvia a key legal advisory role in the restructured firm, praising her integrity. She accepted, relieved to see real leadership for a change. A brief exchange with Sam. Daniel also ran into Sam, the older janitor who'd once offered him friendly advice. Sam looked shocked to see Daniel in a suit, checking in on the custodial staff. Sam, kid, I can't believe it. You really did it. Daniel, laughing. I had a lot of help, but yeah, life's strange sometimes. Sam, with a warm smile. I always knew you were sharp. We'll miss you if you're not around to chat. Daniel, I'll still drop by, though probably not with a mop. They shook hands. For Daniel, it felt like a completion of a cycle. He once was the invisible janitor in these halls, and now he was the man in charge, but he vowed never to forget the humility of his roots. Chapter 28, Final Justice and Forgiveness. Legal fallout. The SEC and the Department of Justice pressed charges against Martin Reeves, Eric Blanchard, and several other high-level conspirators. Trials loomed on the horizon. Daniel's new leadership team provided all the documentation necessary for prosecution, including those damning offshore accounts. Shareholders, outraged at the betrayal, filed civil suits against Martin and Eric. Their personal fortunes were likely to be obliterated by legal fees and settlements. The men who once flew private jets and sneered at the staff found themselves on the brink of ruin. A request for mercy. One afternoon, Daniel received an unanticipated email from Eric Blanchard's legal counsel. It contained a request for a private meeting, insinuating that Eric was willing to apologize in person and discuss a possible settlement. The tone was almost pleading, hinting that Eric needed a character reference or a lighter settlement agreement. Daniel pondered the request. Would he even consider meeting the man who had demeaned him so badly? Did Eric deserve forgiveness, or was it better to let him face the full consequences of his crimes? Meeting or not, ultimately Daniel decided to hear him out. If Eric was truly remorseful, maybe there was space for some form of closure, but Daniel made no promises. He simply arranged a brief appointment in the building's conference room, one that ironically was once off-limits to him. The day arrived, and Eric, looking gaunt and pale, stepped in. Gone were the designer suits. He wore a rumpled jacket and had a trembling hand. Eric quietly, Daniel, I'm sorry. I never thought. I didn't realize. Daniel, coolly, what are you sorry for exactly? Mocking me for being a janitor or stealing millions from innocent shareholders? Eric looked down, tears threatening. Eric, I was an arrogant fool. I got swept up in Martin's schemes. I should have refused. Daniel, you had a choice. A lot of people lost their life savings because of you. Silence settled. Daniel wondered if he felt pity or just disdain. Maybe both. Eric, I know I'll pay for it. The only reason I'm here is, can you help reduce the charges? If I cooperate fully, can your firm drop the civil suit against me? I can't go to jail. Daniel sighed. Tip. Even in remorse, Eric sought self-preservation. Still, Daniel remembered Lena, Sam, and countless others who had no voice. Daniel, we won't stand in the way of justice, but if you cooperate with the authorities fully, maybe they'll reduce the sentence. That's their call, not mine. As for the civil suit, I'll discuss it with the board, but understand you owe restitution to the people you harmed. Eric nodded, tears slipping down his cheeks. He was a broken man. Daniel felt no joy in this. As Eric left, Daniel sat alone, ruminating on the ephemeral nature of power and how quickly it can shift. Chapter 29, Rebirth. A rebranded entity. Months passed. The restructured firm, now operating under a new name, Arroyo and Partners Financial, slowly regained stability. Daniel's leadership style emphasized accountability and open communication. They launched new products with a transparent fee structure, hoping to regain the public's trust. Though the road to recovery was long, the new brand started attracting smaller clients who admired Daniel's underdog story. Media outlets reported on the transformation, praising the unusual CEO who once swept floors. Personal transformation. With his newfound wealth, Daniel upgraded his living situation. He moved into a comfortable two-bedroom apartment closer to the city's center. However, he resisted lavish excesses. He recalled too well how Martin, Eric, and others had fallen prey to greed. He also continued studying finance and management. Knowledge was his real superpower. Occasionally, he gave talks at community centers, inspiring others who felt trapped in low-wage jobs. He shared the lesson that observation, education, and unwavering determination could break down walls. Reflections on forgiveness. Was Daniel truly satisfied? Part of him still grappled with the moral ambiguities. He had used insider knowledge to time his trades, though it was never proven he'd broken specific insider trading laws. The system was complex enough that he maneuvered in a gray zone. Some might call him cunning, others might call him unethical. He told himself that the end result was a more honest firm and corrupt individuals faced justice. Whether to forgive them was another question. He discovered forgiveness was not just about exonerating the other person, it was about letting go of hatred. He tried gradually to let go of the bitterness he felt for Martin and Eric. He had triumphed and they had fallen. Dwelling on it only poisoned his own peace. Chapter 30, A New Horizon Anniversary Reflection. A full year and change had passed since that fateful night when Daniel overheard the secret meeting about fraud. Now he stood by the large window of his corner office overlooking the bustling city. The hum of computers and distant chatter of employees filled the corridor behind him. He took a quiet moment to reflect on the improbable journey. Janitor at Comard and Reeves, dismissed as a nobody. Secret student of finance, devouring knowledge in the shadows, betrayed by arrogant executives. Overheard enough to realize the company was built on corruption. Invested at night, grew a small fortune, then shorted the firm when scandal broke. Bought controlling shares at rock-bottom prices, took over the company, and fired those who once mocked him. It felt like a story plucked from a Hollywood script, yet it was all very real. He thought of how many others, trapped in menial jobs, had untapped brilliance. Not everyone got the same opportunity or the same stroke of luck, but maybe Daniel's success could spotlight the need to treat every person, whether a janitor or an executive, with respect. The ultimate question as Daniel prepared for a press conference, where reporters would undoubtedly ask him about the downfall of Comard and Reeves and the executives who once ridiculed him. He recalled the final question that often arises: would he have forgiven them? In truth, it was complicated. He wanted the world to be better, to see justice done, and to move past bitterness. The men who scorned him caused tremendous harm, and they deserved the consequences. Did that automatically negate the possibility of mercy? Perhaps mercy was something that had to be earned, not demanded. He sighed, straightened his tie, and stepped out of his office into the hallway. Flanked by a new wave of loyal employees, he strode toward the conference room. Camera lights glowed through the glass doors, capturing the silhouette of a man who had climbed from janitorial obscurity to corporate power in just 1 year. He didn't regret his actions. Hard work, cunning, and a bit of righteous revenge had paid off. Now, at the press conference, he'd share his philosophy: treat people with dignity, stay vigilant against corruption, and never underestimate anyone's potential. Justice was served. The corrupt executives are gone, facing investigations and legal action. Daniel, the once mocked janitor, used his knowledge and relentless drive to buy out the very company that dismissed him. Would you have forgiven them or let them suffer the full consequences of their actions? Let us know your thoughts. And if you believe that hard work always pays off, subscribe, because every underdog story reminds us that no dream is too big and no goal is out of reach if you stay determined, observant, and patient in your pursuit of success.